So broadly, if you're working in produced music, you might be making electronic dance music where patterns and grooves conforming to a grid is kind of part and parcel of that kind of machine-like quality that we like so much about computer music. But it's also the case that you might be working on productions which need to feel like they have more groove and more kind of human feel about them. And what's interesting about that is that sometimes those worlds collide. If we take the idea of the Amen break, for example, that's kind of become one of the most sampled, probably the most sampled sort of piece of music ever. And effectively, it can fit into everything from soul-like records where the kind of original groove of that drum performance can retain its original sort of loose feel, or at sort of double speed, it can become part of much more sort of rigid sounding, breakbeaty, almost drum and bassy types of tracks. So what we're going to do within this chapter is to look at how we can sort of play around with programming a sort of live feel to our tracks. Now what we can do is to build that up from literally a live performance of something, and what I'm going to do is to basically put together a little kick and snare pattern and then separately some hats, and what we'll do is to try and program something which has got a little bit of funk, a little bit of groove in it, where we're using some of the benefits of working with quantize a little bit, but we're also thinking about trying to retain a sort of human feel. So I'm going to program something and then we'll just begin to see how we can sort of amend or adjust little bits of MIDI to sort of maximize the sort of human feel of the performances that we are going to work with. So let's start with kick and snare. Okay, so here's something that I'm playing straight away. Now I'm actually playing through a plugin. I'm using the UAD Fairchild compressor, and immediately that's introducing some latency, and of course I can get around that by going into low latency mode, but actually I'm kind of okay with the fact that this groove has got a little bit of lateness kind of built into it from scratch. Obviously what I can do straight away is to have a look at the MIDI that I've recorded, and sure enough I'm going to see that quite a lot of it's just a little bit late. And again, of course, I can reach for quantize and I can absolutely perfect every single note so that we're going down to a sort of 16th note grid and everything will be in time. But what I want to do is to retain a sense of that 16th note at the same time as keeping some of my original performance. So as we've seen in another chapter, the way that I'm going to do that is to come down and adjust quantize strength to 75%. That's going to basically move every note that I've played 3/4 of the way to being absolutely in time. So I'm going to keep a little bit of the kind of lateness or natural sort of feel of the way that I played. But of course, groove comes down to much more than just where the notes fit into a grid. It's also about how each note feels within the context of the track. Let's have a listen to just these two elements, the kick and the snare, across these two bars. Okay, now what I want to do is to have this sense of a backbeat. So this snare where it sits right now is kind of about right, but the kind of more intermediate little snare hits, they need to feel less important than they do right now. So what we can do is to sort of turn them almost into what we call ghost notes. Rather than sort of full strength hits, what we're going to do instead is to back those down, and I'm going to do that using velocity. What I can do is to select these two notes, I'm just going to turn off MIDI out, and just select these two notes. I'm going to pull them right down in volume so that they're much less significant. This little sort of offbeat snare, I like this more. It's not a ghost note, but I don't want it to feel quite as strong as the backbeat element that I've got here. And then I'm going to do the same thing here, just pull these down so that they become a little bit more ghost-like and less strong in nature. And then this one, which actually falls on beat 4 rather than halfway through it, that can stay nice and strong. Okay, now these have gone too far, they're now too soft, but the idea is a good one, which is that effectively we're sort of, we're bringing down the significance of these notes. I'm just going to select all 4 of these and just bring them up a little bit more. Now, depending on which kit you're using, you might also find that different snare alternatives exist. So quite frequently, I'm using a kick down here and I'm using this snare. But around this main snare, I've also got some other little alternatives as well. So what I'm going to do is, again, just produce a little bit of variation by trying out a couple of different snares on different hits, just so we get a slightly different feel. Let's just see what that feels like. And on this last one, I'm going to come up to this slightly more aggressive hit. I'm going to turn its velocity down a little bit, but we're just starting to produce a little bit more variation. Okay, now I discovered another little note a moment ago which I quite like. I'm going to copy this snare here, and I'm going to just take it back to the 16th note beforehand, and I think here I've got this little drag which is happening at this point. Now I think I'm right in saying that when this note plays just by itself, it continues to run on, but I think it will be interrupted by one of the snares or this snare that comes after it, which means that I'm just going to get this little drag for just a moment, which is then going to be sort of stopped short by the snare that comes after it. That's nice. This last snare is too heavy. I'm going to just turn that down a little bit, and this drag's a little bit too heavy as well, but I really like the little skip that that's giving me. Okay, and now I've gone too far again with this hit. In fact, I think I am going to take that down to our main snare again. I'm just going to turn its volume back up. And experimenting with velocity and individual note choices can be a really nice way to work. Now, the same thing can also be applied to hi-hats as well, and quite frequently, particularly if you're working with more acoustic style kits. What we do is we get locked into using one particular hi-hat. If I go and find a hi-hat, I might decide that I want to program my whole pattern for this one hi-hat. But frequently what we'll find, particularly across more acoustic-based kits, is that there are going to be hi-hats everywhere. So I've got an open one here, sort of half closed and closed. Okay. So I've got some really nice little variations here. Now what we tend to do is to sort of find one hi-hat and program for that one note. But frequently what we're going to discover is that much more interesting natural sounding hi-hat parts come from just varying our hi-hats a little bit. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to program a pattern for just two, and then what we'll do is we'll experiment with what happens when we separate those out across a broader sort of collection of sounds. Okay, so again, my timing's not great. What I'm going to do is to come down again to 16th notes, and what I'm going to do is to, again, pull the strength down a little bit so I'm retaining a little bit of the original feel. And what I'm then going to do is just to go through, I think I'm right in saying, I've got two hi-hats here, and two in the octave above. And what I'm going to do is just to experiment a little bit with what happens when I produce a little bit of variation on a few of these hits. Let's take this one up to a full open hat, which I think I'm going to find there. And what we'll do is we'll just change a few of these around a little bit as well. Again, I'm just experimenting with different hits, different velocities, opportunities just to find little variations. And what I can do is just to loop around a couple of bars until I find something that feels right. And of course I can move notes back in time. I can take individual notes and quantize them a bit more strongly if I want something to feel like it's absolutely on a grid line. This very first note is a little bit late, for instance. And what I might decide to do would be to just press this little Q button so it absolutely sort of lands on the downbeat so that that one's absolutely bang in time every time we come back to the beginning. So this idea of working with ghost notes comes from this notion that obviously we don't want all of our hits to be exactly the same. There's a difference between where we might play a snare on a backbeat and where we might just produce little drags and individual hits that are much less significant in little syncopated moments in between the most important hits. So whether it's velocity variation, individual hit variation within our kits, what we can do if we want to produce something which feels a little bit more natural is to experiment with all these different ways of just shifting notes around. And remember, this all came from a recording that I made myself rather than drawing notes into the grid. And even if my timing's out, what I can do is to make sure that I'm retaining some of the feel that I played so that something doesn't sound, or at least don't sound too robotic.